Chapter 15 The Divine Atelier April 14th, 2086 The Stormbreakers? Scarlett asked. Well, that explains a lot. And you said they're the ones you were traveling with when Yasin and Malachi found you? Inez nodded silently. It had been almost an hour since the narrow escape from Bannack. Inez, Scarlett, David, and several other members of the military were seated together in the galley of a UN frigate. Inez Vasquez and Rafi Bakir were with the group as well, helping the soldiers with their weapons and armor. The starship itself was flying through the uppermost layers of the atmosphere, cutting a path southwest towards its sunrise. As the journey carried on, the full story of the sudden attack on Bannack became known to all. Scarlett cursed when she learned the Stormbreakers had not only been part of the attack, but they had narrowly missed getting a visual on herself and Inez. Inez was starting to feel tired after her lucky escape, but something was nagging on the back of her mind, and she just needed to ask. Taking a deep breath, she said, "Mom, when I was with the Stormbreakers, they said they were chosen for a special mission, and that I was supposed to be with them. But who chose the new Stormbreakers in the first place? And why did they want me on the team at all?" Scarlett leaned back in her chair and folded her arms. Letting her chin touch her chest, the spymaster was so deep in thought that Inez did not dare to make sudden or loud noises. Finally, after a few short moments, Scarlett looked up at her daughter again. "Incredible," Scarlett replied. "Until this very moment, until you said something, I didn't realize the Stormbreakers were taking orders from someone. I thought they were acting on their own." The other people in the galley started to speak up, all voicing their own opinions on who the secret person behind the Stormbreakers could be. "It has to be some kind of benefactor," David mused. "That starship the Stormbreakers use must be expensive to fuel and maintain. Not to mention their weapons. I'll bet they've got a secret bankroller." Rafi Bakir stepped forward and voiced his own opinion. "Director, we should consider the possibility that one of our enemies could be behind this, controlling and commanding the Stormbreakers. Degra Keswick, or Blake Robinson, or Marka Ranjanui." At this, Inez found her voice. "What? No way," she protested. "The Stormbreakers are heroes." Inez knew at once that this was the wrong thing to say. She got dirty looks from several people around the room, including from Rafi Bakir, who said, "I do hope you're referring to the original Stormbreakers, Jericho's allies from the Second Hyperspace War." "These new Stormbreakers are just as good as the old ones," Inez insisted. "You know what I mean, they're not the bad guys. They saved Cassandra, and they saved me too." Rafi gave Inez a stern look and said, "Taking you away from UN workers who only wanted to help you doesn't strike me as something the good guys would do, Agent Espinosa." "Yeah," chimed in Inez Vasquez. "Those fighters did a lot of horrible things before they met up with you, Espinosa." Inez looked from the others to her mother. Scarlett nodded grimly. "The people you met, the so-called Stormbreakers, have committed a long list of crimes against the United Nations of Earth. They stole a warship from the UN Navy, attacked and killed countless soldiers and Marines. They murdered Jericho's disciples and desecrated her holy sites. The degenerates who dare to use the name of Jericho's old team are dangerous and unhinged." Inez gave up on trying to keep up a conversation. Scarlett had failed to answer the original question. Varian had said Inez was chosen for something. But what? Inez tried to get her mother to talk to her again, but Scarlett had already stood up and was leaving the galley. "I have to talk to the captain." Scarlett was speaking to Rafi. "We need to make sure no one is following us to Florida." Inez watched her mother leave and hesitated. She wasn't sure if it was a good idea to follow Scarlett or chase her down, but Inez's moment of indecision was suddenly ended when somebody grabbed her hand. Hey, did the director ever answer your question? It was David Sepulveda. The central officer of XCOM was looking at Inez with a quizzical expression. Inez shook her head. Figured. She does that, David replied. Come on, follow me. Pulling Inez by the hand, David led her out of the galley and into the hallway. They were located along one of the exterior hulls of the frigate, and a window on the right side allowed Inez to look out and see that the ship was flying some 10 miles above the surface of the Earth. The lights of cities below winked out of the darkness like a starfield, far different in quality than the one above it. Director! David called down the hallway. Director Freeman, a moment! David and Inez ran to catch up with Scarlett, who had turned around and was waiting for them about 20 yards ahead. Need something, Central? Scarlett asked. Not me, David repeated. Inez wanted to follow up with you on her first question. David let go of Inez's hand and looked sheepishly at the floor. Inez could tell he was going through quite a lot of emotions. David was waiting for the inevitable outburst from Inez that usually followed the use of a nickname she hated. He was also holding on to hope. Hope that he made a good impression on Inez. All of this under a layer of... Inez quickly shook her head to clear her thoughts. She should have guessed that David would have feelings for her, and was a little surprised that she failed to notice earlier. Anyway, I'll let you finish your chat. David stepped away and back into the galley. Inez and Scarlett looked at one another for a moment. Scarlett had an annoyed expression on her face, and Inez knew her mother was irked about being interrupted in the middle of some other task. Mom, Inez began, when I was with the Stormbreakers, Varian said they were chosen for an important mission. And I was chosen too. I was supposed to be with them. Do you know anything about that? The expression on Scarlett's face went through an incredible change. All traces of annoyance were gone, replaced with a look of barely suppressed triumph. When Scarlett spoke, her voice wavered intensely, a sign of the emotion she was holding back. Varian? Did you say Varian? As in Varian Robinson? Is Varian the one called Uplink? Inez shook her head. No, Varian is Aeneas. She could see, clear as day, that her mother was thinking very fast. Then, without warning, Scarlett lurched forward and grabbed Inez in a very tight hug. Inez let out a little squeak as Scarlett put her into a very affectionate embrace. Then, after a moment, she realized that Scarlett was actually crying. Thank you, Scarlett sobbed. We suspected, but we never knew. We've got a name to a face, and now we'll get some justice. Then, Scarlett released Inez and gently held her face in her hands. You are the best daughter I ever could have asked for, Inez, Scarlett breathed. I love you. The sudden outpouring of love and affection coming from her mother overwhelmed Inez, and she leaned forward to return it with interest, hugging Scarlett and whispering, I love you too, Mom. I never should have sent you away, Scarlett said, because Varian is right. You were chosen. That's why I was planning to bring you back to Bannack, and that's why your dad took Cassandra. Inez found herself bursting with new questions. Why, she started to say, but Scarlett interrupted. You and Subject 2 were selected to play an important role in the Prometheus project, Scarlett said. I can't really describe it without showing it to you, so that's what'll happen when we land. Scarlett led Inez up to the bridge, where the captain and his crew were operating the frigate. While Inez watched, Scarlett ordered the captain to make sure that he reached the Divine Atelier as soon as possible. Inez did not ask what the Divine Atelier was. She had a hunch she would find out soon enough. A moment later, Scarlett moved to the hyperwave relay terminal and sent a short message. Then Scarlett said to Inez, "When we get to Florida, you'll understand everything." April 15th, 2086. Cape Canaveral, Florida. The frigate slipped below the clouds, descending toward a landmass that jutted out from the eastern coast of Florida. A river and lagoon broke up the region, creating an island with a lengthy cape jutting out into the Atlantic Ocean. Both the island and cape were home to an incredible complex of facilities. Launch and landing pads lined the waterfront, while massive warehouses and dry docks accommodated starships the size of small towns. A network of roads crisscrossed the area, each one being wide enough to accommodate frigate-sized vessels. Inez had never seen a spaceport in her life, and she kept her face pressed up against a window as the frigate descended, taking in everything there was to see. Even though it was late at night, the Kennedy Space Center was very busy. Starships were coming and going from the facility like bees from a hive, while cars, trucks, buses, and other assorted vehicles clogged the roads below. Out at sea, watercraft plied the ocean waves, moving along the canal to the seaport. At first, Inez thought she was looking at a spaceport on the outskirts of a large city. Then, she realized the true nature of this place. Cape Canaveral and the adjacent Kennedy Space Center were, in fact, a spaceport the size of a large city, bigger than Detroit itself. "Wow," Inez breathed. "This is incredible." "You haven't seen anything yet," Scarlett said with a laugh. "Look there, to the north of that small lagoon. Do you see that?" Inez had to squint her eyes to see what her mother was pointing at. In the darkness, she could just make out a constellation of lights, arranged in a 3x5 grid pattern. "What's down there?" Inez asked. "The very thing you were chosen for," Scarlett replied. "And the reason why sending you away was the biggest mistake I ever could have made." The frigate landed near the center of the spaceport, adjacent to a building that stood nearly 500 feet tall. Inez got a good look at the structure as she stepped off the frigate. Strangely enough, she could see that this giant building had two large doors that were almost as tall as the building itself. Also, there were three symbols that caught Inez's eye. First, the UN insignia was covering up a black and red mark on the southwest corner of the building. Inez guessed that the symbol of the old Advent regime had been replaced with the UN logo. Additionally, someone had painted over the old NASA logo with a bright blue XCOM shield. Finally, the flag of the International Atomic Energy Agency was flying from a pole on the top of the structure. As soon as her mother debarked, Inez poked her arm, pointed to the building, and asked, "So, what's that?" A century ago, before the Second Hyperspace War, that place was the Vehicle Assembly Building, Scarlett explained. It was the nerve center of the spaceport and the birthplace of some of the very first human spacecraft. Now, that's where we build Prometheus engines, the real, full-sized ones. But that's not what I want you to see. You need to see what the engine is going to power. An armored car pulled up to the landing pad. David Sepulveda opened the rear passenger door and held it for Inez and Scarlett. Once they were both inside, he stepped into the front passenger seat and ordered the driver to head for the Divine Atelier. "Divine what?" Inez repeated. "You could call it my personal workshop," Scarlett replied. where the most important of my work is being done. It's right underneath the dry docks you need to see, and from now on, it's going to be your home. The armored car pulled onto a large road marked Kennedy Parkway and started to drive northwest. Out of the right window, Inez saw a cove of shallow brown water, dotted with islands covered in wetland flora. To the left, Inez could see a collection of hangar bays, some of which had their doors open. Inside, spacecraft of incredible design were being looked over by crews of engineers. Then the car pulled off and arrived at its destination. Not waiting for David to open the door, Inez ran out of the car, crossed the parking lot, and grabbed hold of the guardrail to keep herself steady as she took in the incredible sight before her. 3 rectangular holes were carved right into the ground. Each one was roughly 400 yards long and nearly 100 wide. When Inez spotted the cranes, scaffolding, and elevators in each pit, she realized that these were dry docks. In each one, a star cruiser was under construction. The most remarkable feature of these warships was not their shape or size, but their primary weapon. Inez was by no means an expert on space combat, but even she knew what a spinal-mounted weapon was. Each of these cruisers had a massive and powerful-looking cannon embedded deep within the frame, to the point where Inez could say that the ship was built around the gigantic gun. It was an imposing sight. Scarlett and David joined Inez, while the driver hung back, leaning against the armored car. "You're building these?" Inez asked. "Oh, not by myself," Scarlett laughed, "but I am the one who made this happen." "What you are looking at is the final word in the history of warfare," David explained. "The Prophet-class command cruiser." "Thanks to the Prometheus Engine," Scarlett said, "these will be the first warships since Jericho's Trinity to carry fully operational psionic weapons." Open-mouthed, Inez looked back and forth from the star cruisers to her mother and back again. Finally, Inez found her voice. "Incredible," she said. "You could stop your enemies cold with these things." "Exactly," Scarlett said. "With the power of the mind unlocked, large-scale pitched battles like the war in heaven will become a thing of the past. The next enemies of humankind will be defeated through mass mental manipulation. With just one of these ships, we can drive a 1,000,000-man army to destroy itself through panic and confusion, or break a nation's will to fight with but a snap of our fingers. Human supremacy can be achieved without bloodshed." Impressed, Inez let out a low whistle. "And the Prometheus Engine powers the ships?" she asked. "No, just the weapon," David corrected her. "The main weapon of the Prophet class is called the Divine Enforcer. It's miniaturized planet killer tech we lifted off the Partogans." "It was a nightmare figuring out how to shrink a planet-killing weapon to the point where it could be mounted on a cruiser," Scarlett admitted. "The biggest problem was finding a sufficient source of psionic energy to power the Divine Enforcer. That's where the Prometheus Engine comes in. And it's also where your father left the picture." Inez stumbled as a wave of understanding rolled over her. "Wait a minute. Dad left because the Prometheus Engine draws psionic energy from a living host," Scarlett finished. "Yes." Inez started to say something, but Scarlett continued. "And you should know, Inez, Emmanuel was intimately involved in the creation of the Divine Enforcer. He came up with the original design. He conceived it. Mouth dry, Inez said, "What about Cassandra?" Scarlett waved a hand dismissively and answered, "The process is not fatal. Because of the way the Prometheus Engine is designed, hurting or killing the host is counterproductive. Subject 2 will be fine, just as you told her she would be." Inez gripped the handrail tightly. "Mom, I really don't think I'm comfortable doing that to Cassandra." "I know," Scarlett said. "David and I talked it over with Polly after that night on level 7. We've come up with a solution that we think will be best for everyone." Scarlett took Inez by the shoulder and looked her in the eyes. "Inez, Subject 2 landed at the spaceport a little before we did. Now, tell me, who do you think Subject 1 was? And where are they now?" Inez's brain chugged along like an overloaded motor. Try as she might, she could not think of any other person she knew with the gift. "It's Jericho, right?" she guessed. Scarlett and David both gave each other a knowing look, as though an unspoken message had passed between them. "If we had the ability to make Jericho stay here and work for us, we'd have done it already," David said. "She does her own thing, wherever she is." Scarlett put both hands on Inez's shoulders now. "Listen to me, Inez. When you were younger, did you ever get inside somebody's head? And I don't mean just guessing what they were thinking. I mean, did you truly understand their every motive and instinct? And did you ever have an effect or influence on someone that couldn't be explained by logic?" David added. "Besides my stupid teenage self, of course." Inez finally realized what her mother was insinuating. "Wait, you think I'm..." Inez could not finish her sentence. "Have you ever, say, bewitched someone with your singing voice?" Scarlett pressed. "Has anyone called you a siren before?" Inez felt her mouth go dry. It made sense, but at the same time, it did not. 5 years ago, when we put you through that test in the Psi Lab, all the results came back negative," Scarlett said. "I thought you were mundane and powerless. We sent you away and struck you off the records. Subject 1 came to nothing. But then we saw the same readings coming off Subject 2. And I knew I made a horrible mistake and started trying to bring you back." "So, wait a minute." Inez broke her mother's grip and took a few steps back. She was breathing deeply, trying to steady herself. "You're really saying I'm gifted?" Scarlett and David looked at one another. Then they both shook their heads. "No," Scarlett said. "You have psionic sensitivity. That means the neurons in your brain are configured to detect psionic energy. But we don't think you can consciously control it the way a gifted person does. Based on what we've seen, your sensitivity seems to function on an unconscious level. And that's why you were chosen for the project," David concluded. "It takes a gifted person to power the Prometheus Engine," Scarlett explained. "They're the catalyst. But a separate sensitive person has to operate the Divine Enforcer. That person is the conduit. That's why we needed you back. Starting tonight, you and Subject 2 will work together on the same ship." Scarlett leaned over the guardrail and pointed toward one of the Prophet-class cruisers in the dry dock. "That ship, right there. Do you see it, Inez? That is the Akhenaten. Subject 2 is going to be the catalyst for its main weapon. You are going to serve as her conduit. And..." Scarlett gave her daughter a gentle smile. This is my personal gift to you, Inez, for being such a strong and incredible daughter. You are going to be the Akhenaten's commanding officer." Inez was feeling dizzy. This was all too much. "You want me to command a starship?" she said. "I've never even been to space." "You've proven your loyalty to us. That means you can be trusted with a command," David said. "And don't worry, Akhenaten isn't finished and won't be ready to fly for some time. In the meantime, you'll be going through space training like everyone else. Akhenaten has a crew of 2,700, and hardly any of them have flown in space before. You'll be in familiar company. By the time you finish, you'll be ready to take command of the Akhenaten. Heck, the ship might not be ready to fly by then, at any rate." Inez hesitated. She had a few reservations. "Mom, be serious for a second. Look at me. Would the crew even take orders from me?" A dark look came over Scarlett's face. "You forget who your mother is," Scarlett said. "I got where I am because I command blind, unquestioning obedience. And in time, you will too." Inez could not argue against that. She had seen the deferential way her mother was treated by everyone around her. When Inez cast her eyes to the ground, David said, "She just needs convincing, Director. Give her time." "Agreed," Scarlett replied in a dangerous tone. "But I don't need time to prove the strength of my command." Then, in a sudden movement, Scarlett turned to face the armored car driver, who had been quietly listening to all of this from about 10 feet away. Scarlett pointed at him and spoke in a calm voice. "Throw yourself off the edge." The driver's eyes widened in horror, but Scarlett did not repeat herself. Without a moment's hesitation, the driver darted towards the guardrail and was over the railing before Inez could even cry out. Inez raced forward to look over the edge. She was expecting to see a red stain on the bottom of the pit some 200 feet below. Instead, to her surprise, Inez spotted the man sprawled on another ledge about 10 feet below, shaken but otherwise unharmed. I didn't know that was there," Inez breathed with a sigh of relief. "Neither did he," Scarlett said. "I can teach you to make your words into someone else's law, Inez. As my daughter, you have a right to that kind of knowledge." It was in that moment that Inez made her decision. It would involve closing the door on ever returning to the Stormbreakers, but she was fine with that. Because ever since Cassandra had shown up on Opal's doorstep in Novi, the words from her father's letter had echoed in her mind again and again. Cassandra is the victim in all of this. Cassandra was innocent. She needs to be protected. If Cassandra was stationed aboard the vessel Inez commanded, then Inez would be able to prevent Cassandra from being mistreated anymore. But of course, that would mean Inez would have to completely dedicate herself to her mother's cause. Inez would ally herself to Pascal Etienne and make herself into an enemy of the Stormbreakers and their allies. The next time Inez met her close friend Lawrence Ridge, they would be on opposing sides, and that realization hurt Inez more than anything else. But this was the only option. Inez would protect Cassandra at any expense, including her own. Inez faced her mother and said, "All right, I'm listening." Scarlett put one hand around her daughter's shoulder and steered her into a nearby building. The Divine Atelier was a large, rectangular building overlooking the dry docks. Century-old paint on the facade revealed this place used to be the main Apollo facility. Resting on a pedestal in front of the main entrance was an actual Apollo spacecraft from the 1970s. It looked so small and inconsequential in comparison to the mighty star cruisers being built only a short distance away. April 15th, 2086. Honolulu, Hawaii. On the island of Oahu, the sun was starting to rise. The gentle hum of electric cars and trucks complemented the singing of birds and crashing of ocean waves. It was shaping up to be another beautiful day in this Pacific paradise. In the heart of the city, a sleek electric car navigated the packed streets while the driver carried on a pleasant conversation with two passengers. "We can't thank you enough for giving us a lift," said a man from the back passenger seat. "All of our plans changed at the last minute." "No problem," replied the driver. "Any friend of Hana is a friend of mine." The male passenger put an arm around his wife and squeezed her affectionately. "So, how long do you think it'll take to reach the Capitol building from here?" the passenger asked. "Oh, not long at all," said the driver. "Honolulu traffic is easy to figure out once you've lived here as long as I have." And sure enough, in what felt like no time at all, the car arrived at the Iolani Palace, just down the street from the Grand Complex that served as the political core of the Hawaiian Republic. Of course, because this was a government complex, the car had to pass through a UN checkpoint before it could enter. The driver rolled down all of the windows while heavily armed UN soldiers approached the car from all sides. "Good morning, gentlemen," said the driver. All of the soldiers smiled and waved. They were relaxed and comfortable. Nearly all of the troops had holstered their weapons and were asking permission to shake hands with the people in the car. One soldier, an officer, approached the driver's window and asked, "Look, man, I know this is annoying, but we have to follow standard procedure. Please identify yourself and your passengers for the record." The driver said his own name first, then introduced his passengers. "My name is Christopher Wright, and behind me are Himawari Robinson, although she prefers you call her Hana, and that's her husband, Amako Padariki." Chris, Himawari, and Amako all handed over their identification cards, while another soldier said, "Chris Wright? You're the history dude who wrote those books about the paradox, right?" "Yes, I am," Chris replied. The soldier was so excited that he actually jumped a little. "My kids are gonna freak when I tell them I met you," the trooper replied. "We're all big fans." Chris started to say his thanks when he noticed the officer walking back towards the car. To his genuine alarm, Chris noticed that the officer's expression had changed. He now looked deeply concerned and upset. "Officer, is something the matter?" Chris said. "Yeah, there is." The officer's voice was filled with shock and disbelief. "Chris, I have to detain all three of you." Instinctively, Chris lowered his left hand, keeping his fingertips above the buttons that controlled the door locks. "Hey man, what's going on?" Amako asked from the back seat. The officer turned to look at Himawari and said, "Himawari Robinson, step out of the car. UN Interpol has issued a warrant for your arrest. I'm placing you in custody on suspicion of aiding and abetting a terrorist." Himawari looked at the officer for a moment, then cupped one hand to her ear before she spoke aloud in very poor, broken English. "I am deaf. I am deaf. I cannot hear you." Simultaneously, Amako and Chris turned to face Himawari. Both men gave her a series of hand signals that only she could understand. A look of dawning comprehension came over Himawari's face. "Tell her to step out of the car," the officer commanded. "Now, before we drag her out." The mood was changing very quickly. Soldiers looked around, confused. This was no ordinary person. This was Himawari Robinson. Her father, Blake, was one of the most powerful men on the Hawaiian Islands, and a legendary war hero to boot. Arresting his physically disabled daughter was going to have wide-reaching consequences, regardless of the reason. One more time, the officer demanded Himawari step out of the car. Alarmingly, the officer reached down and put one hand on his holster. Amako and Chris looked at Himawari, who now fully understood the situation. Slowly, Himawari raised her right hand to eye level. Then, she stuck out her thumb, index, and pinky finger, while keeping the middle and ring fingers together and tucked in. Keeping her fingers like this, she bobbed her hand back and forth twice. Himawari had spoken only one single word in sign language, but Chris and Amako perfectly understood the message she was trying to send. Moving as fast as he could, Chris locked the doors and slammed his foot onto the accelerator. The electric car shot forward and through the checkpoint, while soldiers shouted at them to stop. "Put your heads down!" Chris yelled as he rolled up the windows. Amako put one hand on his wife's head and forced her to hide in the footwell. Then, he shifted over in the seat so his own body would hide Himawari from view. Chris drove a high-speed circle around the Iolani Palace before getting back on the main road, nearly hitting a statue of King Kamehameha. Sirens began to sound across the government complex, and in a matter of seconds, half a dozen police cars filed onto the road, giving chase. As he drove, Chris punched a button on the touchscreen next to the central console. "Call Randall!" A nasally voice picked up the phone call. "Murphy," said the nasally voice. "Randall, it's Chris," Chris said. "Get the Angel onto the runway and spool her up for takeoff. We've got blueheads chasing us. They're after Hannah." "Damn it all to hell," Randall replied. "Get to the runway. I'll do the rest." A loud thudding noise caught the attention of everyone in the car. "What the hell was that?" Chris shouted. "Gunfire," Amako reported. "Those cops are shooting at us!" Not waiting to see if Amako was right, Chris jerked the wheel hard and swerved into a public transit lane. Dodging and weaving around a city bus, Chris looked out the rearview mirror just in time to see that one of the police cars had pulled over to the side of the road and a cop was standing on the hood of another car, taking aim with an assault rifle. "Hold on!" Chris yelled. He turned the car sharply, making a note of the street signs as he went. He knew exactly how to get to the airport from here, but the cops were not going to make this easy. Up ahead, there was a sudden clearing in the traffic. With 4 lanes of city streets clear, another police car pulled alongside the fleeing vehicle and matched its speed. Amako shouted, "He's gonna shoot!" Chris had just enough time to see the police car pulling up on his left before a cop was leaning out of the passenger window and aiming a stutter mag. The compact submachine gun let out a chattering noise, followed up by the thudding of Gauss rounds into the side of Chris's car. Pulling hard on the wheel, Chris managed to place a semi-truck between himself and the attacking car. Suddenly, the city streets gave way to a network of 6-lane freeway bridges. The city of Honolulu was quickly left behind, and now the town of Pearl Harbor lay before the fugitive car. Chris knew the Robinson family mansion was in Pearl City, just on the other side of the harbor, but he knew they would never get there in time. "Right side!" Amako yelled. Another police car had drawn level with the fugitives. This one came even closer before a weapon was aimed out of the driver's side window. Before Chris could react, Amako rolled down the right side passenger window and lunged out to meet the oncoming attack. head and shoulders out of the car, Amako reached out and grabbed the cop's weapon before he could pull the trigger. In the ensuing scuffle, Amako somehow managed to gain control of the laser pistol. He turned the weapon against the police car. There was a flash of searing red light, and the police car began to pull off the road, completely engulfed in flames. Amako fired the laser pistol wildly out the window, forcing even more of the police to withdraw. But the trio's problems were far from over. A UN Army vehicle, laden with an array of terrifying weapons, was now joining the pursuit. Amako kept blasting away while Chris made one last turn. Honolulu Airport was on alert. Armed guards were positioning themselves outside of the entrances and exits, while Sky Rangers patrolled the air above. Of course, the soldiers at the gate were expecting the fugitive car to try and smash their way through, but none of the defenders were expecting Himawari to have inside help. With a great crash, one of the hangar doors burst open as a spaceship emerged from within. Old and worn, scarred by many a past fight, the Battlemaster-class gunship Archangel was 50 years past her prime. Yet her sudden appearance on the scene caused just the right amount of chaos, because the Archangel's fame preceded the ship itself. The pilots of both Sky Rangers were so intimidated by the Archangel that they completely forgot the old spaceplane was no longer a warship, and thus stripped of her weapon systems. The Sky Rangers scattered, fleeing the area at high speed. Soldiers on the ground saw the spaceplane smash its way out of the hangar and turned to flee. The 5 men on the checkpoint only had a few seconds to register this development before Chris Wright drove his car through the checkpoint at top speed. None of the soldiers were able to draw their weapons on time before the car smashed through the chain-linked fence and kept going. But a series of spike strips on the road did what those men could not. All 4 tires were shredded into pieces. Riding on the rims alone, the car was able to reach the airport apron before running out of energy and coming to a stop. The Archangel was just over 500 feet away, its boarding ramp lowered and ready for 3 more people. Chris, Himawari, and Amako all clambered out of the car. Chris pointed to the spaceplane and shouted, "Go! I'll hold them off!" Himawari and Amako started running. On the boarding ramp, a small, skinny man who looked a little like a weasel appeared and waved his arms. This was Himawari's ex-husband, Randall Murphy, the new commanding officer of the Archangel. "Come on!" he yelled. "You can make it, Hana! Keep running!" While Himawari and Amako made for the Angel, Chris turned around to face the other direction. He could see the UN Army vehicle bearing down on him now, the airport terminal behind it. The troop carrier opened its doors and 4 XCOM soldiers stepped out, all of them wearing power armor and carrying plasma weapons. The soldiers yelled and shouted for Chris and the others to stop, and then they gave chase. The Archangel was just ahead. The spaceplane was rolling forward as her nuclear ramjet engines roared to life. The boarding ramp scraped the tarmac, throwing sparks into the air. Himawari was the first up the ramp, followed by Amako. She turned around to look for Chris, who was a little further behind. She waved at him and screamed wordlessly, pointing at something behind Chris. Instinctively, Chris turned his head and looked back. He should not have done that. A beautiful woman with long white hair, dressed in flowing white robes and a golden corset, advanced on Chris with supernatural speed. Before Chris could do or say anything, Jericho locked her vivid blue eyes on his own. Instantly, all of the strength went out of Chris's body. His arms and legs went numb, and he collapsed to the tarmac. Chris was dazed. He could not think straight. He even had trouble comprehending where he was or what was going on. Chris was suddenly lost in a sea of sounds and lights that made no sense to him whatsoever. Then came a new sensation. like a powerful wind pushing Chris in one direction. Without warning or fanfare, Chris was forced to relive dozens upon dozens of memories. In vivid detail, Chris watched as countless meetings with friends and allies replayed in front of him, conversations with Blake Robinson and Robert Lansing, sensitive meetings with powerful people, and secrets he swore to keep were extracted from his mind with surgical precision. In a matter of seconds, it was over. Chris was so stunned that he could not even comprehend the fact that his mind had just been violently ransacked. Chris might have been down for the count, but he was not done yet. The instant the assault began, he started reaching into his coat for a very special device. Chris had received it from Blake Robinson himself, and it was meant for situations just like this. Of course, Chris had hesitated to use the device when he saw Jericho, thinking her to be a friend, but now that she was invading his mind, he had no choice. With the last of his strength, Chris reached into his coat and produced a tightly sealed metal canister. There was no label, but there was a handwritten message on the side, which said this: "Contains one sentient nightmare, for emergency use only." There was a pocket knife in Chris's coat, but he had run out of strength. It was all he could do to grab the canister and pull it out of his pocket. But then, without intending to do so, his enemies brought about their own demise. Jericho stepped to one side, allowing the XCOM soldiers to reach Chris and apprehend him. One of the soldiers grabbed the canister from Chris, threw it down on the ground, and then stomped it with his boot. With a high-pitched hiss, the contents of the bottle escaped. A nearly opaque black cloud hung in midair just over the runway, while tiny green lights winked on and off within its murky depths. The casual observer would have mistaken this dark cloud for ordinary smoke, but Chris knew everything about its true nature. He had just unleashed a Spectre. The Spectre was a robotic weapon system dating back to the Second Hyperspace War. What appeared to be a formless black cloud was actually a swarm of microscopic nanomachines working together in perfect, synchronized coordination. The XCOM soldiers paused in their advance. All of them were young men. None had ever seen a Spectre before. Nobody had fought one in 50 years. It was assumed they were all destroyed when Advent fell. The dark cloud of nanobots moved in unison, buzzing like a swarm of angry locusts as they came together. Then one of the soldiers shouted, "Don't just stand there! Shoot it!" Chris put his hands over his head as gunfire erupted around him, followed swiftly by strangled cries and screams. Daring to look up, Chris saw that 3 of the soldiers were now lying on the ground, their bodies bloody and broken. The Spectre turned against the 4th man, enveloping his body within a swirling black cloud. Chris tried to crawl away on his hands and knees, but an invisible force latched itself onto his body and held him fast. It felt like Chris was trapped in a vice. "You're not going anywhere!" Jericho shouted. But the Spectre had finally turned its attention onto her. The swirling cloud of nanobots coalesced and came together into a shape that vaguely resembled the human form. Then it lunged at Jericho. With a sweep of her hand, Jericho created a wall of soul fire between herself and the Spectre. The green flames flickered and wavered, granting Chris only brief views of the Spectre on the other side. Then, without warning, the Spectre struck. A black bolt shot through the soul fire and would have hit Jericho, but instead the projectile flattened out in midair like a pancake. A telekinetic shield wavered around Jericho as she returned the hostile nanobots to sender without so much as a flinch. the specter suddenly shed its physical form once more, and the swarm closed in on Jericho, ignoring the green fire and pressing itself against the invisible barrier surrounding her. Jericho waved her hands in front of her, slashing at the buzzing mass that closed in from all sides. Two pairs of hands grabbed Chris and dragged him along the asphalt. There was a mighty crack like a sound of thunder, as Chris and his rescuers were peppered with a hailstorm of nanobots. Jericho was not free for long, however, as the specter started to reform. Taking a human shape again, the specter grabbed Jericho by the arm and stopped her from chasing after Chris. Jericho whipped around and blasted the specter with a beam of emerald light from her hand. By then, Chris was safely away. He felt the familiar carpet of the Archangel boarding ramp for just a moment before he came to rest somewhere in the crew cabin. Then the spaceplane thundered down the runway before lifting off, wind whipping through the wide-open entry hatch. Somebody reached over Chris's inert body and pulled the door closed just as the whole city of Honolulu came into view through it. Flying low over the surface of the Pacific Ocean, the Archangel set a course to the northwest. In the cockpit, Himawari sat in the engineer's chair, while her husband, Amako, and her ex-husband, Randall, flew the spaceplane. Once they were clear of Hawaii, the trio held a very grave conversation. For Himawari's convenience, all three people spoke in sign language. "Was that who I thought it was?" Randall asked. "I think so," Himawari replied. "That was the fake Jericho." "And what did she do to the history dude back there?" said Amako. "I have a hunch," Randall answered. "Do either of you know about the Elders Chosen from the Second Hyperspace War? I read somewhere they could use the gift to just steal information out of someone's head. It sure looked like Jericho was doing that to Chris. Or, the fake Jericho, anyway." Both men looked at Himawari. She looked crestfallen. "So that means the Jericho impersonator knows everything Chris does now." Randall punched the dashboard in anger. "Damn it," he swore. "You know what this means, right?" "Yeah," Amako said. "Whoever she's working for is about to burn through all of our intel. Our side is about to take some really hard hits." "Hana, maybe we should call your parents." "No, we can't," Himawari answered. "The less they know about what we're doing, the safer they'll be." "Sure, but by now the whole world is going to know you're a wanted criminal," Amako said. "What the hell do you think they're trying to charge you with anyway?" "Probably something like associating with the enemy," Himawari said, "because I know about Varian and..." Himawari trailed off. She had a look on her face that conveyed sudden understanding. "They know," she said. "They must have figured out the names of the Stormbreakers. That explains why they'd put a warrant out for me." Randall swore again. "Okay, that really means we can't go to your parents then. Blake and Chihiro will probably have to disavow us." "I'll be fine with that," Himawari said. "As long as my dad can legally stay in the contest for Secretary General, we have a chance." The group stopped talking for a while. Amako twitched the controls, making sure the spaceplane stayed below 50 meters of altitude, the UN military's radar floor. After a while, Chris Wright recovered and stumbled into the cockpit before sitting in the second engineer's chair opposite Himawari. "What the hell happened?" Chris muttered. "We escaped, for now," Amako said. "Now, we have to make sure we live to fight another day," Himawari added. "How do we do that anyway?" Randall cut in. "The UN's going to be looking for us, and they'll be looking for this ship now too. So where can we go? We need to find a safe port. Any idea?" Everyone took a moment to think. Then, Amako leaned forward, grabbed a star chart, and unfolded it. He was looking at a map of nearby star systems. "I have an idea," Amako said. "Runhan." "The Runhan system?" Chris asked. "I've never heard of it." No, Amako said. "Runhan's not a system, she's a woman. Runhan Santah. She's neck-deep in the Higaran criminal underworld. A real scoundrel, but she owes me a favor and her family knows about it." Amako pointed to a star system on the map. "She lives in the city of Hakihea, a very famous place. It's an experimental colony where people from every species in the galaxy live together. Best part is, Hakihea uses a condominium government, so it's the perfect place for us to hide from the UN. And this Runhan woman, do you trust her?" Amako nodded. "Runhan and I go way back. I knew her long before I met you, Hana." Himawari frowned. "Yet you never mentioned her once." Himawari narrowed her eyes at her husband. "Well," Amako sighed, that's because you stole me from her." Himawari giggled. "Nice save, Romeo," Himawari sniggered as she asked, "But what makes you think Runhan's going to help us?" "Runhan owes me one," Amako said quickly, refusing to look his wife in the eye. "She owes me a debt." "Why's that?" Himawari asked. "What does she owe you?" To her surprise, Amako suddenly looked embarrassed. Both Randall and Chris looked sheepishly at the ground, as though they were sharing in Amako's shame. Himawari started to ask for an explanation, but Chris cut her off. "Trust me on this. You don't want to know. Randall, don't tell her. You shouldn't have told me, but you did. And now I'm telling you. You don't want to know." "All right, I'm sold," Himawari told the group with a roll of the eyes. "Let's go to Hakihea." The Archangel pulled up and threw her nuclear ramjet engines into full throttle. In mere moments, the Pacific Ocean was left far behind. The spaceplane rose into the skies, charging its hyperspace module as it went. All four of the people aboard the Archangel felt bad about leaving their homeworld so suddenly and without a proper farewell. Himawari knew that she was doing the right thing, but she also knew that, at least in the near term, things were about to become much more difficult for the Stormbreakers. With a humming sound and a wall of purple light, a quantum wavefront materialized in front of the Archangel. Just before it leapt backwards to envelop the ship and transport it into hyperspace, Himawari closed her eyes and gave a silent prayer for her children. She did not know where her eldest child Varian was, but she knew they were still alive and leading the Stormbreakers. Himawari prayed for Varian to receive their grandfather's wisdom and their grandmother's valor. Himawari was disappointed in her first daughter. Sophie Murphy had joined Pascal Etienne's political campaign and was now working against her own family. Himawari prayed for Sophie to find reason and abandon the Etienne camp. James Padariki was 11 years old, but he was already facing incredible injustice. Amako and Himawari were happy to have had a child together, not for the usual reasons, but because James was one of the very first human Partogan hybrids born on Earth. Himawari prayed for James to find a group of friends who loved him the same way he loved his family. And finally, Himawari spared a moment of prayer for Iraka Padariki. Iraka was Amako's son from a previous marriage, which meant Himawari was Iraka's stepmother. Right now, Iraka was a student at Yutaka Yamamoto University on the planet Terra Nova. She prayed for Iraka to succeed in his ambitions. But in the moment the Archangel was swept into hyperspace, Himawari experienced a moment of hesitation. By instinct, she was addressing her prayers to Jericho, yet somehow it just felt wrong. Himawari knew that Jericho, the real Jericho, was alive and well somewhere on Earth. And now, an imposter, wearing Jericho's name and face, was acting against the people who were supposed to be her friends and allies. And this led to one question that superseded all other concerns. Where is Jericho? And why does she do nothing?